Welcome to the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. I'm your host, Guru Nishan, and I was born and raised in 3HO. And I started this podcast with several intentions, and I like to read them at the beginning of every episode. I want to, number one, break the veil of silence that has long permeated and continues to strangle the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community in the name of neutrality. Number two, to validate and help clarify the complex feelings of those who have joined this lifestyle, were born and raised into it, and or who have practiced or taught Kundalini Yoga. Number three, to encourage active listening to uncomfortable conversations from our community as a revolutionary act of self and collective healing. Number four, to let survivors know that we see them, we believe them, we love them, and we will fight for their truth to be addressed. Number five, to let teachers who are denying, gaslighting, or spiritually bypassing know that what they're doing is willfully ignorant and re-traumatizing victims. Number six, to illuminate the inherent racism, homophobia, cultural appropriation, and exploitation that perpetuates the teachings, 3HO lifestyle, and the overall community ethos. Number seven, to stop the perpetuation of gaslighting and victim shaming by naming it for what it is. Number eight, to dismantle internalized shame, guilt, toxic positivity, and light-washing mentality. Number nine, to honor all of the parts of ourselves that have been forgotten or silenced. Number 10, to honor each and every body that has come through our community, both named and unnamed. And number 11, to encourage people to do their own research, to process their own emotions, to get somatic therapy and other therapy and support as needed, to draw your own conclusions, and to be critical thinkers rather than to just blindly follow anyone. Please remember that your story matters. Please share it when you're ready. We're here to listen and to support you. I want to remind all of you as listeners that the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast is open and available for your story. You're welcome to reach out to me at gn@gurunishan.com or just go to my website to the contact me section. You're also welcome to donate to the support of this podcast. There's a donate section at gurunishan.com if you'd like to make a monthly or one-time donation to support this work. Thank you for those of you that have reached out and shared how the podcast is supporting and helping you in your process of healing and awakening and seeing yourself through perhaps a different lens now that we are hearing from the experiences of people's pain and hurt that have not been spoken out loud. And even just the speaking out loud of our experiences and our stories can be very uncomfortable. And that's a part of the remembering process and the dismembering process. So I want to thank you for your courage and your courage in listening to this podcast. And thank you for your support, all of you who are listening regularly and reaching out and commenting and reviewing. So don't forget to like and review and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Today, we have a guest by the name of Mark Bailey. And I'm going to read Mark Bailey's bio, but then I'm going to give a little context to my connection to that gentleman that is on our podcast today. And I'm very excited about this episode today. Mark Bailey left home at a young age and lived as an artist on the fringes of society. From the ages of 15 to 18, experienced psychological manipulation and abuse from a member of 3HO while a student for Summit School for the Arts in Chisago City, Minnesota, before it was shut down in 1999. He settled down after a serious accident in 2006 and spent the next decade painting pictures while learning to manage 2 chronic illnesses. Since 2014, Mark has worked primarily as a writer. He summarizes news reports for a nonprofit information service, writes articles for the cryptocurrency industry, and maintains a blog. Mark has also published 7 science fiction novels. He works from home and rarely leaves his Minneapolis neighborhood. You can learn more with Mark in his short book, as well as the link to his blog that's written in the information on the podcast. I want to context my relationship with Mark even before we begin, that in November 15th of 2021, I got an email from Mark, and it was in this time after the last recorded episode of this podcast was in September, and I had really been in the swirls of dismantling identity. And I think the last podcast you had listened to was really swirling and like dismantling identity and beginning to really see the supremacy that was just within the 3HO culture as the white woman supremacy episode that I did. And so I was really in the swirls of dismantling my own identity. And so when I get this email from Mark, it was, I'm going to bring it back, but it was just an initial reach out where Mark Bailey was a student as 17 years old at a school called Summit School for the Arts, where I was the program director for about 6 to 7 months. And I was recruited to come work at the school, which was in Chisago City, Minnesota, by my father. And my father was an ex-3HO person by this time. He had moved to Minnesota, but he carried on his persona and spoke about himself as a Guru Nanak Sikh, and still really very much used 3HO and the identity of where he'd come from in this new context of starting the school. And so when I had been recruited to work at the Summit School for the Arts, I was 22 years old, and we'll talk more about that on this podcast. But the initial reach out of the email didn't surprise me, because I don't take it lightly that when I'm speaking out loud about predators and learning to speak clearly and cleanly to abuse and predator behavior that has taken place in my upbringing and in 3HO context and what I've spoken to on our podcast here, I don't take it lightly that the areas of my life where I may have been a predator to other people are going to reveal themselves. And this is something I take seriously and I bring curiosity to, because when I received your email, Mark, I wanted to lean into it, because I realized suddenly, oh, whoa, what happened during that time, I don't really have a lot of remembrance of. I haven't had to look at that. I haven't had to face that. And so I wanted to context that for listeners here, that this email came at a time when I was already wrestling around with identity and shedding illusions of myself and asking for the ability to see myself more clearly. So Mark's email reach out basically made me look at the happenings around the school shutting down. And before we even continue, I just want to say, hi, Mark. Thanks for being here. I want to say that your email was refreshing. You know this. We essentially, listeners, this initial email made me say, oh gosh, what happened during that time? I haven't really spent much time on this. And we had a series of conversations back and forth that we spoke and then exchanged emails and shared stories. And Mark coming on the podcast didn't become relevant to me so much until I read some of Mark's healing process and some of the writing that he had shared with me. And I think before that, I really would like to just share with listeners what that time was like for me, because when I got recruited to work at Summit School for the Arts, my dad had been in the throes for several years of starting schools, and this was kind of his MO. When I was in high school, I had left Minnesota and moved to Africa, and I had remembered sexual abuse from my father and confronted him when I was in high school. And he gaslit me and had a real way with words. And so at that time, I know I just used the strength of what I had to kind of get out from underneath his influence, because I realized he had a lot of psychological influence around me. And I ended up, marrying a man in Africa and living in the South African ashram and just having a wonderful experiences. But by the time I had come back to the US, my context of my upbringing was very much in a community value. Like, so much of my opportunities came from the benefit of where I had come from with 3HO. And South African ashram was one of those experiences, being able to, live and work in the South African 3HO ashram, and then in DC, in the Virginia ashram. And so when I got recruited to work at Summit School for the Arts, for me, it was very normal. It was kind of like the it's not what you know, but who you know, and the benefit, even though by 15, I was very much aware that there was a lot of hypocrisy in our upbringing and infidelity and things that didn't make a lot of sense. I was extracting the benefits of what I felt like was the benefit was the community and the connections and the relationships. And I very much benefited from relationships of the different ashrams. And so I'm 22 years old. I'm back in the United States with my new husband from Kenya, and I want him to meet my dad. And of course, my dad recruits me to come work as a program coordinator. Now, to give you context, I hadn't even finished my degree yet. I was finishing my degree as an independent learner. I had a lot of experience as an independent learner because I had done my high school and my university work as an independent learner. So in my dad's infinite wisdom, he recruits me to be this position in the school that he had started several years ago with some other folks. And I didn't know what I was getting myself into, but I'm a young 22-year-old. And I meet Mark because he was one of the oldest students of Summit School for the Arts. And I'm living on the farmhouse of my dad's farm, my dad's family farm. And I'm running this school with my new husband from Kenya there, who's not working there legally. He's in the United States legally, but he's not working for the school. I'm the one paid. And my dad is also not paid at this school. He is, well, I'll let Mark tell this part, but essentially, Mark was a 17-year-old student when I came to work at the school, and he had already been a student at the school for several years. And what I want listeners to hear is that the initial email he writes out to me is basically like, before the time when the school shut down, I believe I owed you $600 for cannabis. And I want to come clean on that. And I also want to just share my experiences in healing. And I welcome this kind of reach out. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Why would you owe me money for cannabis? Now, for listeners to understand, like, I've always been a proponent of cannabis, and I'm a fan. I always have been, and all the things, but that's not my identity. I didn't have a sense of identity around remembering that Mark owed me money for any, and what any of that was about. So a part of our conversation was like, kind of like, whoa, what actually happened back then? And how did the school get shut down? And what actually took place? And realizing that this time period for me was dark. I didn't have a lot of remembrance. And so Mark's expression and reach out to me kind of sparked an awareness that I didn't have remembrance. And then what happened was a flood of memories came forth. And reading your writings about my father after I had already done a lot of processing and healing around him, and then starting to do this podcast where further down we've been breaking the manipulation and the abuse that is context and housed in 3HO. It was a welcomed exchange to actually hear, obviously not that you were mentally and psychologically abused by him as well, but that you've processed that, and to hear your lens of things. So I want to say thank you for the work you've done on yourself, and the courage you've had to share and write your experiences about healing. Yeah. Anyway, so I want to speak out loud the challenge that happens when people share their stories and their healing experiences, and it shakes up our worldview. It shakes up our own sense of identity around times that perhaps we've forgotten or housed inside of ourselves in distant memories that we don't have to think about. So I don't know where we want to begin, Mark, but I want to just say out loud, this is where we want to begin. Never mind. I know exactly where. So these emails, so the emails are exchanged. I start looking at myself like, what actually took place? And the memory that came forth was that the school had gotten shut down, and it was all very abrupt and it was very fast. And essentially, I played a key role in a lot of the shakeup and the illegal activity and behavior and not having any responsibility in what happened in the aftermath of Summit School shutting down in 1999. And I started to realize that I didn't remember why it was all so fast. And so Mark's sharing of the experience of what actually took place there, do you want to share that? Do you want to help me context that here before we get into Medipiate and what you learned here, like what was actually taking place? Like,
well, I mean, as far as the school shutdown, there were a few different things happening simultaneously. There was non-compliance with the law, just in general, having to do with special ed requirements and maybe other stuff. There was the pot investigation when the police caught wind of this pot selling that we were doing, and and of course it was involving kids in a school, and so everybody freaked out. I was brought in for a long, like 2-hour plus interview, and other students were brought in for interviews. And there was one kid who was disabled and had asthma, and they apparently found pot in his system, and and that was another another prong of it, and so it all kind of came to a head at once in the fall of 1999, and the school was shut down by the end of the year.
So, listeners, Mark reaches out, and this is the information he kind of passes on to me, and it makes me examine this time within myself, like, whoa, what was going on at that time, right? And the remembrance, like the flooding of the memory of remembering all that, like, whoa. And that we had left, me and my husband at the time, we left the farmhouse quite rapidly and moved into St. Paul. And I suddenly remembered I didn't have to take any accountability for what that means as a professional young adult, being a responsible paid employee of a public charter school and having a key role in an investigation around pot and lack of boundaries with kids of that school. And I started to realize that, like, wow, I'm living on the farmhouse with my father, who was an early known predator to me. And then at this time, it's not that I had forgotten, I just didn't necessarily know how to deal with it. And I loved my father for lots of reasons. He had helped me and supported me in so many ways. So it wasn't exactly so clear and cut around, it's just memories that are there, right? So I'm the one getting paid at the school, and my dad strategically wasn't a paid employee. And he generally did that in the communities that he worked in. He served and had influence in lots of ways, but didn't necessarily hold a position of accountability. And so it makes sense that I would get recruited into this position. But I want to say out loud that we left the farmhouse, me and my husband at the time, at the shutdown of the school, and didn't have any connection or follow up with any of the students and anything that happened, or any of the parents, because of this. It was like a local county investigation around pot. And, my dad had been living there for many years. Again, I had just come there for several months and stepped into what I now know is quite a predator's lair. But this is what I'm kind of having awareness of in reflection now. It doesn't take away the responsibility of myself as a young adult in taking a paid position in a public school, supporting children. And the next decade of my life, I ended up in a network marketing business and went into entrepreneurship. So I didn't go into the school system. I didn't have to use a resume to try to use old references of the work I had just come from. And to kind of give credit to my own 22-year-old self, this wasn't uncommon for me either. I'm living on a farmhouse where there's lack of boundaries amongst kids and adults. And, I first learned to use drugs and smoke from my dad and other young adults that I trusted. So this is kind of a real normal thing. And yet it shouldn't be a state of normal. And in reflection, I can say that. And as a functioning, person examining their trauma history, but I want to pause for the feeling of my heart that there are students that I impacted and parents and people that were left because of my irresponsibility and my lack of ability to even know what boundaries were. And what it means to be a victim of trauma and sexual abuse and predatory abuse and not heal to where we can just repeat it and repeat things that are normal to us but aren't actually healthy. A part of the initial reach out as well, and a part of Mark's healing is his own early childhood sexual abuse and his healing from that and his coming out of that, specifically in a small town like Minnesota, like Chisago City or Taylor's Falls, or the communities that we're speaking of. I want to just say that there are listeners that know of this time, of this place, of Chisago City and the farmhouse that my dad was kind of envisioning, this utopia community, and participated in hurting a lot of people. And a lot of people in that community and surroundings communities were hurt and have been hurt and have never been acknowledged. So today, the reason that I'm speaking to this and kind of letting myself be outed in this place, it gives me a distaste in my mouth. It's uncomfortable. And I want you to all to know that. But it didn't become relevant for me to bring on this podcast until a few emails and more disgust within myself about myself, as well as like self-compassion about what it means as the person, the 22-year-old self of mine that was under the influence of my father and his amazing visionary oration. But it was this email, and this is where we're going to segue here. Mark shared with me a little bit of his writings in some of our exchanges. And we both shared early childhood sexual abuse and just the healing process of this, and being open to really examining the Summit School for the Arts shut down and the reasons for it getting shut down. My recollection was very much in that we were out of compliance for special ed regulation. You know, I lived and breathed this school. Everything that I've ever committed to, I've lived and breathed it, to where I've, lost weight and didn't eat, it's like became my life. And when we were getting shut down for helping so many kids, it just didn't make sense to me, and in that story, I also didn't take the responsibility of seeing like, whoa, what am I doing selling pot to a student who's 17 years old? And what am I doing smoking with any of these people or around any of these young people that were students of our school? What are we doing having them spend the night? Like, what? At our house? Like, what? So like all of the layers that could be not good in terms of interfacing with the public sector and private life and farmhouse community living. And so once again, as this is dismantling in me and I'm starting to like look at like, oh my gosh, why was this okay? He shares with me this segment of his writings. And one of them, he comes down and he said, had Summit School not shut down amid scandal, my life might have been very different. Had my mentor Medi Piade not treated me like a guinea pig in his educational experiment, my life might not have been so screwed up. Using a combination of conversations, psychedelic drugs, and manipulations of both my physical and subtle energy bodies, Medi Piade indoctrinated me into a belief system that was neither ethical nor operative in society. Although his actions toward me didn't seem sexual in nature, they were probably as damaging as John Larson's abuse had been. It took years to separate the important truths he espoused from the nonsense and magical thinking in which these truths were embedded. So when I read that, it went from this personal experience of like a shared abuse awareness of like kind of mutual early childhood abuse and my part in being neglectful in the care of my position at Summit School when you were a student, to realizing, holy smokes, like your reflection of what my father, Medi Piade, and your relationship with him was, you nailed that, the psychological and the magical thinking and the pulling apart of what was real in that mentorship from the psychological abuse. And so when I heard that, I was like, whoa, this is absolutely a conversation I want to have on the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast. Because it's not just personal. It's not just about this time where I worked at Summit School and you were a student and me kind of healing my process with that in relation to you. It was no longer just a personal exchange and opportunity for healing between us, but for me, it suddenly became relevant to the context of the 3HO formula that we've already been talking about when it comes to the predator experience is not just about Yogi Bhajan. It's not just this, what he did to the women that have been horrifically abused in his time, in his life, but it's about what's been infused in the teachings and in the behavior and in the psychology of the students that were his earliest students, as well as the permeated ethos that got created that continues to play out in the teachings and in classes and in 3HO overall as an ethos and as a corporation. So this is why I reached out to you. I think you know that, Mark. And I want to just kind of turn it over to you to read what you wanted to share with us, or context any more around how you met Minneapolis and all the things.
Okay, well, I mean, I've just got a chapter from my short book, Navigating Dystopia, that kind of sums up the school and my relationship with Minneapolis and kind of the harm that I experienced as a consequence of that. And then we can zoom in on any part of it that you want once I'm done reading it.
Sounds great.
So, all right, so Summit School for the Arts was a charter school in Chisago City, Minnesota. I first heard about it when I was 15, peddling handmade goods at a craft fair at a local coffee shop. A man with a long white beard and a crocheted cap told me about the school and got me interested. His name was Minneapolis Kalsa. Officially, he was the school's visionary. After dragging my parents to a meeting at the unused summer camp where the school was located, I enrolled. Minneapolis became my mentor. At the school and at his nearby farmhouse, he slowly described his revolutionary vision for the future, with Summit School playing a small but crucial role in this revolution. This made me feel like I was a part of something important. Summit School was small. There was never really more than 50 students, K through 12, and most of the time the student body was only half that size. There was a teacher for the younger kids and a teacher for the older kids, one or two administrators, and parent volunteers usually present. A board of directors was technically responsible for everything. I sat on this board as a student representative beginning at age 16. Learning was mostly self-directed, with each student working an individualized plan. There were some structured classes which were taught by parents or community members. Physical education was perhaps the most interesting. My favorite was fencing, with kinesiology a close second. When I was 16, Minneapolis supplied me with a heroic dose of magic mushrooms at a reggae concert in St. Paul. I left my body and had an amazing journey through an abstract space filled with shapes. Minneapolis later drove me and another student in his car while he was tripping on mushrooms himself. From that point on, drug use became a regular part of our interactions. While I spent a few days a week commuting to college classes in the city, my days at the school were often unstructured. I just did whatever I felt like, and so did everybody else. The permissive environment did produce some good learning outcomes, but the whole thing was basically a hippie fantasy land, which was problematic because it was a publicly funded school. There were times when my schoolwork would consist of endless meetings. There'd be planning meetings and board meetings and grant writing meetings. In between these meetings, I'd meet with Minneapolis and he'd tell me what to say. We'd frequently game out the meetings to come up with the best way to advance his agenda. At the time, I loved the intrigue. For the most part, Summit School's individualized learning plans were great. Its use of community experts to teach classes made perfect sense. The days I spent with another student in an unused basement room, listening to Jefferson Airplane records and making art, did more to prepare me for my real life than regurgitating the contents of some textbook ever could have. The school should have become a great example of effective alternative education. Instead, it became a cautionary tale. At one point, Minneapolis got his daughter Guru Nishan a job with the school, and I started selling weed for her. A community member found out and reported her to the authorities. At the same time, Summit School was found to not be complying with the law. The state shut down the school and the cops started asking questions. My own police interrogation lasted maybe 2 hours. At that time, I was told that Metapiare and his family left town fleeing the investigation. Later, I would learn that they were never even interviewed by police. Fortunately, the state allowed me and a few other students to complete our graduation projects and receive diplomas, but the scandal destroyed my plans for the future. I'd been a poster child for the school's success, and the school failed. I'd been counting on receiving help applying for scholarships, knowing my parents couldn't afford to put me through college, but I had no access to resources like this outside of this failed school. And suddenly, everyone was talking trash about my mentor, which suggested to me that maybe he wasn't such a great guy after all. Eventually, I came to understand that he wasn't just some nice old man. He was a radical ideologue systematically furthering his ideas. Employing a combination of conversations, psychedelic drugs, and manipulations of both my physical and subtle energy bodies, Metapiare indoctrinated me into a belief system that was neither ethical nor operative in society. In the moment, this indoctrination usually seemed playful and spontaneous, yet it always advanced his agenda, and I always played along. In Metapiare's reality, there were regular people and special people. Regular people supported the evil system, while special people were enlightened enough to see the system for what it was. In this belief structure, the rules of the system only applied to regular people. The enlightened pretended to follow the rules to appease the unenlightened regular people, but they were really working in secret to bring about the system's downfall. Now, as a teenage outcast, I completely bought into this worldview. And Metapiare also spent countless hours coaching me to con the regular people in all sorts of ways. Most of this focused on tuning my quality of manner or vibe to produce specific reactions in those I was interacting with. In many instances, the instruction included things like breathing techniques, posture, and control of subtle energies. Sometimes the purpose was to train me to impress education officials. Sometimes it was to teach me how to smuggle contraband without getting caught. Now, the drug use that was a standard part of our interactions made me more receptive to these lessons. With or without Metapiare, I would have been using drugs at that time. But with him, the drug use was always accompanied by philosophical indoctrination. Marijuana, magic mushrooms, meth, other stuff. The use of these substances ensured that I wasn't thinking critically, even as Metapiare swore that learning to think critically was foundational to the philosophy he espoused. Let's see. So that's what I got there.
Oh, listeners, I hope you're letting all that land. Ooh, we might have to go back through that with some stanzas. There were just some points around the world view.
Yeah, and the regular people versus the special people.
The regular people versus the special people. And that the rules only apply to the special, right? To the regular people.
Right.
Yikes. Do you want to talk more about what it was like to, Metapiare was obviously your mentor early, 15, and the school got shut down more like when you were 17, almost 18.
I was 18 when it was shut down, yeah.
You were 18 by this time. So, I really knew you at this 17 to 18. As far as I was concerned, you were an adult independent learner, and everybody, I went to high school as an independent learner too. So basically, like, Mark is an example of what I had done. Like, it was kind of this what he's describing as the revolutionary thing at this time. Like, we're creating independent learners through this special educational system. And I had gone through a public school in St. Paul, Minnesota, where I also did an independent learning curriculum. So this wasn't far off in terms of a utopia idea to get a high school degree through this independent learning system. But the vision, or this particular context of the school, that my dad had started at Summit School for the Arts, he began mentoring you early, and he introduced himself as a Sikh, no?
Oh yeah. I never heard of 3HO through him at all. It was always, he was a Sikh. He talked about Guru Nanak. He'd talk about, the importance of the hair, and he'd talk about the, all the different things. And he would do it enough that it was kind of like part of his standard of communication was describing himself as this holy man to whoever was listening.
So I want listeners to hear this, because by the time my dad had moved to Minnesota, which was around 1992, he had left the 3HO ashram, and he was the minister of the Phoenix ashram until maybe 1990 or something. And so a few years later, he leaves the 3HO community, but he always maintained this identity of himself as this Guru Nanak Sikh. And he would espouse whole philosophies around, Kundalini yoga, as well as, what the real meaning of Sikh is, and just what it was for him, and that he never really was leaving anything, so I really want people to hear that, like, the persona that Mark received from Minneapolis, living in a small town, which happens to be the town that he grew up in. So he's back, and now he's this long-haired, white-bearded man with a kufi cap on, right? He no longer even wore a Sikh turban, but he still espoused the philosophy of himself living a Sikh life. And it was his own interpretation of, I'm a student of life, I'm a student of the Guru, and that he can interpret that in any way that he wants to. But he didn't necessarily live a 3HO lifestyle. He drank alcohol, and, he didn't wear a turban, and obviously plenty of drugs. And I also want listeners to hear that, my dad, he also played that role quite a bit with a lot of the teenagers in 3HO, meaning a lot of the teenagers that were coming back from India in that first age group, which was like 10 years older than me, that first group that went to, GNFC, those that might've been experimenting with drugs. My dad was kind of this gateway person that kind of made it make sense. And so when Mark's talking about the philosophical teaching that came along with the taking of magic mushrooms, or smoking pot, or any psychedelic, any LSD, you name it, my dad would go on and on around how to do it and the right philosophies and all the things, and built this whole persona around himself, justifying why this behavior basically was okay.
Yeah, and I'll also just add that he would talk frequently about his spiritual lineage. And the reason that that's important is that it increases perceptions of credibility in an audience. So he would talk about his spiritual lineage in such a way as to say, oh yeah, you really are the holy man with this direct connection to this guru, and in India way back when. And in rural Minnesota in the late 90s, nobody knew any better.
Yeah, so he would go and do his normal MO, hang out at a coffee shop, and kind of like magnetize whatever people that could then kind of get into his web's layer of, what did you call it? Ideologue of ideas.
Right. Yeah, he was a radical ideologue.
Yeah. That is such a good interpretation of Minneapolis. A radical ideologue. Like, he just spewed ideas, kind of waiting for somebody around him to pick it up and do something with it.
Right. Well, and yeah, and a lot of them were actually good. I mean, one of the reasons I have such a solid environmental awareness is because we'd go through and take walks in the forest, and he would explain things like succession. He would explain how these ecosystems worked. And that was all accurate information. It was just blended with other information that was conditionally accurate or not accurate at all.
Pause. He just said how accurate information is infused with inaccurate information as well as
Conditionally accurate information.
conditionally accurate information. Listen to that. And this is really important to like the spewing of a teaching. We want to make something right or wrong. And that's not exactly how it works, especially with predatory abusive behavior that we become normalized with, right? It's infused with things that are true. So there's a slice of truth in there, and then it's wrapped up with conditionally true information as well as absolutely not true information together. It's enmeshed, which is what makes it so confusing to even be able to identify and name, much less be able to stop. So well said. I just have to say that, like, whoa, the infusion of that. So like, this becomes extremely relevant when we're hearing this wise man persona, that what I'm hearing you say is that he basically made a part of his explanation of himself. And he got to do that, I'm guessing, through the introduction of his name.
Right.
Explain more.
Yeah, so it would be, oftentimes it would be the name, or it would also commonly be the bracelet, you know, because, you know, long beards, that was sometimes a part of it, but more often it would be the things that people hadn't seen before, which are the name or the bracelet, because, you know, those were less common. And
So the
then,
bracelet, let's pause. For those of you that don't know, the 5 Ks of being a Sikh, right? One of them is wearing a kata, right? So we grew up, right? Men wore katas on their right hand, women wore katas on the left hand, and kesh, right? We don't cut our hair as reverence to kesh, the hair. And, you know, I'm not even going to go into all the 5 Ks, but I want to point out that my dad picked and chose what things he wanted to do and still identified himself as a Sikh, whether he's a practicing Sikh. You know, every person has a right to identify them the way they want to with their creator, right? But what my dad did very well is use these identifiers of kind of these areas of exceptionalism or specialness, and maintained an identity and persona that linked to the ancient old lineage of being a Sikh. So there's legitimacy in Guru Nanak, and there's legitimacy in the religion, so that his wise man look, whether it's the beard, Mark's bringing up the kata, he didn't wear a turban at this time, but he still wore like a kufi hat, which would be considered like a Muslim's cap, which obviously still kind of has this wise man persona energy look to it. Now, my dad happened to be bald, so he was probably just trying to find ways to cover his baldness, but he also moved into baseball caps, but not often, because a baseball cap gives a very different persona. Baseball cap and beard.
Baseball cap.
Exactly.
You know,
because,
and I saw him in all types of states, you know, because there were times when we would get hammered together and then like make ham and eat ham. And then he would swear he was still a vegetarian, and we just wouldn't talk about the fact that we had eaten ham and eggs. You know, but I never saw him in a baseball cap. I feel like that would have been too far for him to go in our relationship.
He needed to maintain a level of wisdom and philosophical wisdom.
Right.
This is extremely relevant in the sense that even though my dad had left 3HO and somebody can leave the Dharma, they can also carry on a very long history of unprocessed and unmetabolized pain and of trauma in their own, and play out the philosophies. And my dad did that very well. He played out really good ideas that he never really brought to, that he never ever brought full circle and supported fully, and so the I find that why this is so important is this is a non 3HO community that he ends up creating in an entirely different city called Chisago City, Minnesota. And it's not a context of 3HO anymore. And yet what you're pointing out essentially in what you just read is a level of psychological and subtle body manipulation that he not only played out as a member of the visionary of the school, which I'd like you to talk a little bit more about, if you would, but also played out specifically in his mentorship to you. And that was unique. I don't think he necessarily did psychedelics with just any student at the school. Like you were like this protege. I don't know if that's the right word, but this kind of one under the wing that you were going to represent the success of the school. And I'd like you to talk about that as well.
So
prodigy, that's the word. Prodigy. You're the prodigy.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I'm aware, he only used psychedelics with one other student at the school. And then, and it was all the older students. But
I was going to say that was purely an age thing. I don't think my dad had much discernment. I think it was a pure age thing, no?
Right. And I think even more than just the age thing, I think he was always gauging whether or not it would get him in trouble. And he figured he could do anything with me and it wouldn't get him in trouble because I was, already a well-known delinquent. So in his capacity as visionary at the school, he was, to say he was manipulative doesn't quite capture the level of influence he exercised, because he would go through systematically and look at every single person who was going to be involved in a decision, and he would look at their personalities and he would look at their weak spots, and he would figure out a way to push them like buttons until he could hit the objective that he wanted. And it could be something like a rule change at the school, or maybe like who had input into a decision. It was always, the minutia of the school's operations. He was deeply involved in them, even though I'm not sure he ever sat on the board. But I sat on the board. And,
hold on, pause. He never really had a board position. He just influenced every single board member.
As far as I know.
Wow, that is so wild to think that he wasn't on the board, because he went to every meeting. He was like the main head of all the meetings almost, I want to say.
Yeah, that's how it seemed. And when he wasn't doing it, it was me in there basically speaking with his voice. So it was like, it's hard to even picture an organization like a school being run so completely by one person, especially because they weren't in any official position of authority. But that's kind of how it was like his school that he was running according to his philosophy, and then the means by which it was run was manipulating people. Whether it was me or other community members, he'd call them up and say one thing to one person and another thing to another person and another thing to another person. And at the meeting, they would all say what he predicted they would say, and then he would get the result he wanted.
Whoa. And this is all from when you first began, from 2000, when you were 15 years old?
Yeah.
And my understanding of how the school, do you know how many years earlier the school was started before you got there?
I got there right away. It was a very short-lived thing. So it was the first year the school was in operation. I
got it.
Signed up and was a part of it, and then I turned 16 immediately after it opened, because my birthday's in the fall.
Got it. And I know that from the limited understanding I have, he had started it. Him and his wife had started it with another couple, and then the other couple, who was more like the foundation of the knowing the laws and education and how charter schools run and kind of like all the real organizing and making things happen couple, they dropped out. And then, my dad's wife at the time, my stepmom, she was focused on her job elsewhere. And so he ended up becoming the person that kept this vision alive. And whoever else was still there after all that initial dismantle. And then came this kind of new revival. I don't know when all that happened, but
Yeah, I think there was probably a couple of years of preparation to be done before the school ever opened. So I'd imagine, I remember hearing about that other couple and they were the founders, but then they bowed out before the school ever officially opened, such that by the time I was there, it was kind of like Metapiare trying to wrangle everybody, and then he found me, and, I was a bright kid, and I had already quit school to teach myself a year or two before. And so I was already on the independent learning track, and I was like the perfect person to help him realize his vision.
And this is a really important context for everyone to hear, that once again, it's like he's wrangling, Meripiade's wrangling, all the different elements and controlling the narrative. He's basically painting the picture, planting the seeds in all of the participants. And as Mark described, getting the result he wants by making sure each of the board members are the mouthpiece essentially for the suggestive influence that he planted in all of them. And to have that runnings happening before he did all this in Minnesota, my dad was the minister of the 3HO community in Phoenix. So he's not learning community and how, these types of things out of nowhere, right? There's a history to this. And this is what's so important about how this relates to 3HO, because subtle body manipulation, psychological suggestion, these types of things are very much embedded in our upbringing. It's very much embedded in the teachings, the repetitive, suggestive, operative experiences that we've grown up around, that perhaps we haven't seen it as such. And that's why I find Mark's story so helpful, because he doesn't join 3HO. He doesn't join Kundalini yoga. And yet he got into the web's layer of somebody who very much came from a context of 3HO, of subtle body manipulation, and carried on that predator behavior in another community in the way he learned to formulate this Summit School for the Arts community. And that at a young age, Mark becomes the prize mentee of this wise visionary who's creating a utopia school of, future thinking and the possibility of all that can be, to reshape education, economics, and agriculture.
And war too, because it was always about ending war.
There was always the war model. Yes. It took you a while. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, I think we were going in the same place. For a long time after the school shut down, I firmly believed that, Metapiare's instruction was sound, and that, he had done really a good thing. And it was just these, the evil system had messed up this utopia. And it took me a long time of really carefully going over the things that actually happened, and the information that I got, and really, how that affected me in my life, to understand that, I didn't really receive great instruction from Metapiare. He basically programmed me in a way that didn't make sense for the real world. And so that caused all kinds of problems. And most of them were very subtle. You know, it would be like I would make a decision in a moment and I wouldn't even think about it. And then I would have to look back and say, oh shit, I just totally manipulated that person. I just did exactly what Meta Piata used to do. And I got my way and I don't feel good about it. And the reason I don't feel good about it is because it's wrong to manipulate people. You know, but it took me years to figure that out.
By recognizing it in yourself.
Yeah.
I can very much relate to that. To notice that you're doing something that somebody did to you that you didn't like.
Right.
But then
Or
suddenly,
even if I liked it in the moment, it's like some things are just wrong. You know, you take away someone's willpower when you manipulate them. And so that's abusive.
yeah, and suggestive thinking and psychological manipulation, where we're taking away someone's willpower. Like Mark is talking about having the experience, naming the experience of a mentor of his that influenced his ability to feel his own will and to make choices for himself. And I wanted to say that, you know, when I was in high school, I became aware of that in relation to my father, that his influence over me made it very hard for me to distinguish what I wanted. And I automatically wanted what he wanted me to say. And I was so good at that I couldn't even notice I was doing that. And it took me not being under his influence to begin to even be able to feel like, yeah, there is a decision of mine that wants to be made, but it's so cloaked within the influence of his atmosphere. And that is what I'm hearing you say, is it's just so similar like that.
Yeah.
And this can be really similar to like what we're experiencing in our community, right? And 3HO is like things that we've always contexted and lived within one frame of it. Suddenly, when you pull outside of that frame, you can begin to feel that there was always another feeling, but you never had the permission to actually notice that. And you couldn't feel yourself under that level of psychological manipulation. I think this is what's really challenging about saying that the teachings are what's such a wonderful technology, because it's not taking into account how much predatory behavior is infused within the teachings themselves that are actually kind of built-in psychological manipulative processes that we don't even recognize as control, thinking control, mind control, because it's so infused within this wonderful technology that is good for the nervous system or whatever. This is where I think we fall prey to that within KRI and Kundalini Yoga and all of that. And also how this person who unidentified with 3HO, who maintained this persona, carries on this wisdom formula and continues to spew psychological manipulation, subtle body control, and teaching Mark how to then do it, not just have it done to him, but he then played that out. And this is how you begin to dissect and notice it in yourself. So tell us more. So like you went from seeing this worldview as like a good worldview to suddenly being able to see it for what it actually is, instead of through this lens that you were taught to see it.
Yeah. And, you know, it was kind of like a really slow process for me that was tangled up with, you know, my own healing from sexual abuse from a community member that was unrelated to this, and you know, and dealing with chronic illness. And I went through all kinds of complicated traditional and alternative healing stuff, and it kind of slowly became more and more clear. But then what what really crystallized my understanding was when I started working for the website wanttoknow.info, where, I was working for, and I still do, a high-level State Department whistleblower. And the website is all about corruption and cover-ups. And so I started really diving into the mind control experiments that had gone on, that our government did, that other governments did, that cults do, and I got a really clear understanding of that. And as that understanding grew, I started realizing that Metapiate's instructions were hitting all the buttons, literally all the buttons of, okay, here we've got the psychedelic drugs, okay, here we've got extreme physical exertion, like we'd go on these long, intense walks, okay, here we've got this type of communication, okay, here, and it just one thing after another. And I realized that his program was a mind control program. That was like, he was actually carrying out with me the same kinds of things that the CIA tried to and failed to carry out with other people in the 50s and 60s. And so, so that's when it really hit home, like, fuck, like, yeah, I was, I hate the term brainwashed because it doesn't really describe things accurately, but I was very much under his influence as a result of his application of these mind control techniques, and so.
Well said. I processed so much about my relationship with my dad over decades, all the way up until he died in 2006. But I have to say that when I read and hear you describe it, it nails manipulative behavior, narcissistic behavior, sociopathic behavior. It nails this behavior so clearly. And it's, when something's like embedded in your family, it feels a little more messy and entangled. So to hear it from your lens, it's not just personal. It's a very predatory formula, what he's talking about, right? You're talking about just check mark, check, check, check. Oh yeah, all of these behaviors are what's used at high level CIA to brainwash and manipulate. And like, this is a regular part of the MO of relating, of community organizing, of healthy community sustainability, of critical thinking, and this is what I find is so important here as well, is that predators are spewing predator behavior a lot of times and, quote, don't identify as a predator.
Right.
In his utopia, I think earnestly he lived in his own false world of not seeing clearly himself.
Yeah, and I think he also, one story he told often, and I was surprised that he told it so often, was about when he was much younger and he was living in San Francisco, and they had a water dispenser that was dosed with LSD. And so guests would come over to their apartment and they would get some water and they would be dosed with LSD. And he always told the stories about, how his cousin came over and it was so funny when he realized what was happening, but, thinking back on it, you don't dose someone with LSD without their consent because that's assault. And the fact that he looked so fondly back on that whole episode, it's fucking shocking when I think about it now, and that he was telling me that story when I was a teenager, like, oh, that's a normal thing to do. It's like, no, that's really bad.
Yeah, when we come into the conversation around consent, right? Purely speaking, out of the 60s, and everybody must be drinking LSD, I guess, at that time. But still, like, what is going on? What I like what you're saying is the worldview that he would take on and then make everything fit within that worldview of rightness. And it goes back to what you're saying of the special people and the regular people. and the rules of who applies to what and the navigating of that. Because on one hand, I think that Mary Piare and my father really believed so much of what he put out, but he also took zero responsibility or accountability for anything past, present, or future. And this hearing you describe a checkmark formula of manipulative behavior as a normal process, for me, it really houses his behavior so much more crystal clear as a long history of intentional manipulation. It wasn't like a byproduct similar to what we're seeing in 3HO and YB's behavior. Like, these are intentional controlling behaviors to get people to systematic to get people to relinquish their own will and do the things you want them to do. So was there more what you went through in terms of awakening to realizing he wasn't a real mentor, that he was actually really had embedded like manipulative tactics that you found yourself running on?
Well, I mean, it's the kind of thing that there's always more the more you dig. I guess one of the biggest things I noticed in my life was that, there were behaviors that I would hide even from people who were close to me for a long time when I was younger. So they might be, it could be anything, totally innocuous, but for whatever reason, I would feel like, oh, I've got to hide when I smoke a cigarette from this person, or, oh, I've got to hide when I, do this. And the way that I would experience myself in those moments of, oh, I've got to do something that this person won't understand. I've got to be secretive about it. That was always like, Mera Piare really effectively taught me how to hide things, whether it was information or problematic behaviors. We would, I won't even tell you some of the stuff that we would do, but there were situations that we were in where we could have gotten in big trouble, like big legal trouble even. And we would have if it weren't for his teaching me how to be secretive in this very particular way that I'm convinced he learned when he worked in the Arizona prison system. Because that was, and he would talk about, he would teach me lessons from his time working with the prisoners, and, like his, one he told all the time was about this guy who was in maximum security and was blind and somehow assembled everything he needed to make liquor, to distill liquor in a cell. And he would go through the details of that and how that worked. And then he would apply that to, okay, so we're looking at this situation over here. So what do we need to make our liquor? We need this, we need this, we need this. Okay, how do we get all that stuff together to, to make it happen?
Oh, I just want you to keep telling stories. First of all, my dad taught, he was a chaplain, Kundalini yoga minister, Sikh Dharma minister rather, at maximum security prisons in Arizona, detention facilities. Much of my childhood, and I would also get all sorts of lectures around the prison system and its equation to the educational system and all sorts of things. I never got these types of things, but what I want to point out about what you're talking about that he did is he's rallying this group kind of revolution around this idea of like needing to overcome when you're as stuck as somebody in a maximum security prison cell, right? So you're creating a whole story and notion, which is like inspiring an element in the human longing to be a part of something bigger. So it's playing on our longing to belong, and then using manipulative tactics to get people on board for whatever it is that that person is casting. And this is cult level. This is what happened in the upbringing of our own experience of 3HO cult, but it didn't come from Eddie Piade. You know, he might have perfected it in his particular ways, but this is very much relevant to the infusion of the whole culture in which we were embedded in, and what YB was doing, and then what he was doing with that next level of leadership, and the men leadership versus the women's leadership, and really looking at the tactics that you're speaking to. That's why I want you to tell more stories, because when you say it, it helps us see it.
Okay, well, I mean, maybe the next place to take this then is the subtle energy stuff, because that's a piece of it that not everyone really even has a context for. You know, so usually for me, you know, he would sometimes do certain kinds of chakra balancing. Yeah, that's the right face to make, because
My dad doing chakra balancing. Let me just take a moment. That was my puke face. Oh, Lord.
Right.
But back to the chakra balancing. Let me clear your chakras. Let me read your Akashic records, all of the special wise formulas that people from spiritual communities that might have left their community hold on and keep a narrative and persona in the next community that they end up in, and use these manipulative language to sound more expertise and as a way to access your energy system. So
Right.
Go ahead. I want to hear what he actually said. That one was terrible.
Well, so sometimes it was just playful and fun, like, oh, you need a pranic jolt, and then you get the particular kind of slap on the back to realign your energies. You know, other times it was more directed, where there'd be like half an hour to an hour of, you know, laying down and having the energy be worked on. So that was the overt subtle energy manipulation I referred to. And then there was also learning to identify your own subtle energy body and how it's operating, and then how to observe other people's energy and where their energy might be stuck or what might be going on with it. And so, you know, there were times when we'd go out in public and he'd, you know, point out, okay, what do you think about this person's energy? You know, what do you think about this person's energy? You know, and he basically trained me to correctly observe what was going on with other people's subtle energy. You know, so that's been pretty useful in my life, but I gotta say it was super weird, and especially in combination with all this other stuff.
I wanted to say I'm mortified by the pranic jolt and to hit you in the back, do that thing. And then you're saying you'd take you out in public and actually train you to look at people's bodies and energy bodies, and like where energy is in their system and where it's how. The fact that this is taught out loud is a little blowing my mind, ladies and gentlemen. Like, I am remembering that this is very much what I remember growing up, but it's like a weird kind of an internal memory that, like, we got that because we grew up around that. But why would you ever say that out loud as a teaching is what shows up to me. And realizing, like, some of the kids have talked about getting the pranic jolt as a part of like abuse. So once again, the fact that this is just being taught, that there were times where this was like actually things he mentored and taught to you and exchanged as this like holy teacher or this Kundalini teacher or whatever he was framing himself as, to teach you how to manage your own energy and to manage and read other people's energy.
Yeah.
It's such psychological manipulation, and it's using spiritual wisdom in such a manipulative way, teaching a young person about themselves through this lens of dynamic control in a way.
Yeah.
I'm quite bothered, I knew my dad mentored and supported people in different ways, but like to hear the ways that he was actually teaching a young person like you in this capacity is feeling quite disgusting inside.
Yeah. Well, and I still have kind of mixed feelings about it, because it's like, I think every kid should be taught about subtle energy. I think that should just be a standard thing in every culture because it's a part of who we are, you know? So I'm glad I learned about it, but it totally creeps me out. The more time goes by, the more I learn, the more it creeps me out how it was actually done. And yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll also just say I don't really have a lot of opportunities to say this stuff out loud. So I appreciate the opportunity to just kind of share this because I don't think there are too many people who would even understand.
That's how a lot of us feel in 3HO. A lot of the things we say out loud really only matter to other people that have experienced it because there's no places to say these things out loud and have them be context or made any sense as to why it's so weird or entangled inside. And what you're saying goes back to the complexity of where fragments of truth are commingled with convenient truth and things that are not true at all, right? And that combination around, like, on one hand, it is a very powerful thing to know our subtle bodies and to know our own energy bodies. I find what is extra confusing about this holy man, holy woman, healer, spiritual persona, shaman, guru, teacher, coach, persona that people draw on their backgrounds of experiences, whether they spent X amount of years in this community or X amount of years of this lineage or X amount of years of Tibet or India or blah, 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 right? And then they're drawing on their persona to then, once again, infuse elements of truth, which is really great. And then, but with other ways that it's actually quite predatory and quite manipulative. And you can't always distinguish between it all, especially the more we come from childhood abuse, right? The more we have unprocessed, unmetabolized abuse, the more we're going to draw in these experiences because on some level it's familiar and comfortable and supporting us. But what I want to say specifically in relation to what you're saying is that it's disguised so well, and Mark is really painting a picture of where a man positioned himself as a holy scholar with a lot of powerful philosophies that were housed in very real and truthful pedagogies. And these pedagogies included agriculture and sustainability and farming, and they included education, and they included a new world view of economics and peace versus war, and just like this whole us versus them model. And that is so cult-like, right? It's a training of a worldview. It's making the us versus them. It's a special thing. And it's taking fragments of real truth and putting it all together into a new formed identity. And how scary it is that you don't have to join 3HO or Kundalini yoga to be ending up in the manipulative web of a lot of people who have been influenced by such communities. such as this. So here Mark is a young man growing up and gets pulled into, a web of manipulation and deceit. And on one level, I know it's really supported you, your own educational experience, as much as it was not good. There was also things you've grabbed that have been great. And even your experience, like you said, you were doing you were experimenting with drugs without Medipiate, but he added an element of indoctrination. But I was going to add spiritual wisdom, that it's felt like spiritual wisdom, but it's actually an encoded indoctrination. So the indoctrination lives on. And just for the record, when the school shut down and the students, were able to get the support they needed to make sure that they graduated, the oldest students, me and Face Wally obviously skipped the county and went to St. Paul to protect probably my legality, because I was working there legally and probably would have taken the most responsibility. And, my dad didn't end up leaving for a while, and Cutting didn't leave for a while, but within that next year, both of them ended up, she left him, and then he ended up skipping town and doing his own health journey, but he ended up in another community called Harbin Hot Springs. And I absolutely know that he just took that same persona, the wise man, holy man persona, and did it all again in another community and influenced people in whatever ways. And one doesn't have to sexually touch somebody to be passing on an abusive and predatory formula that they take into the next community, where they're the next coach or the next neighborhood. Do you want to speak to a little bit about this? Because I know you're quite familiar with people that abuse and then carry on in communities, rechanging their persona.
Yeah, is there any part in particular you want me to speak to?
Just the challenge of what it means as a survivor that's speaking out about abuse, and realizing that the system isn't there to support you as the voice, that these men, whether it was the one who was sexually abusing you early, or Medipiate was subtle and psychologically manipulating you, how the communities, do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, well, so, I mean, I'll just say, like, I was sexually abused by a man named John Larson from the ages of 14 to 16. So there was actually some overlap there between the time when I was being sexually abused by one guy, and then I met your dad and, became his mentee. So part of what I was trying to do in becoming involved with your dad in this school and everything was escape this abusive situation that I was in, where I was living on this property owned by a community member who was abusing me. So in 2003, I reported John Larson to the authorities, opened an investigation, did all of that in Taylors Falls, Minnesota, which is in the same county as the school was in. And the response I got from the community was basically, "You're crazy and you made it all up." And that's, like, my family was really supportive, but the community itself was the opposite of supportive. When the school shut down, especially because I was 18 by that time, it felt to me like everything was my fault, and the information that I was getting from the community was like, "Hey, this is all your fault." And so like, what that taught me is that the abusers, if they're in, positions of relative power, if they're socially popular, etc., they can do whatever they want. And if you speak up about it, you're the one who's gonna, catch the worst end of it. And that was my experience, in both those situations. And I think in society broadly that may be changing, because this was 20 years ago, but it's changing slowly. And the knee-jerk reaction that most people have when they hear about abuse, if it's in any way personal to them, if it's someone that they know or whatever, denial is like the first thing where, oh, I can't believe that would happen, and then oftentimes it's followed up by anger. Oh, I can't believe that would happen, and how dare you bring it up to me, and so no matter what kind of abuse it is, whether it's sexual or psychological or physical or what have you, the whole fine structure of our society is designed to facilitate the abuse and not the healing. And so,
Well said.
yeah, I don't know if there's a good solution to that beyond what we're doing now, just talking about it.
Yeah, I was going to just say talking about it and being willing to relook at something through the eyes of curiosity to say, what if it wasn't what I framed it to be all these years? What if it wasn't healthy and good? What if it wasn't? Now, it doesn't mean that good parts completely get washed away, but it's a willingness to look through the picture, through the frame with a new lens so that we can name it for what it is, so that the real distillation or the real processing can start taking place, as opposed to kind of like it's just pushed away and you just house it as, oh, that was okay. Well, was it okay? What if it weren't okay? Who would I be? Who would they be if that were not okay? Right. And you start to see everything suddenly through a different lens because you've opened yourself to the possibility that says, maybe that wasn't such a healthy mentorship. Well, what was it actually then? And it somehow I feel like, I don't know if this is the right words, but the universe conspires to then bring the next thing into your atmosphere to let you dig a little deeper, right? So whether it was like looking at the CIA manipulative tactics that allow you to then reframe your own experiences, and maybe it's this podcast for some people, right? It's listening to this conversation that says, oh, wow, something that I would have never named abuse. What if it was? What would that mean? What else didn't I see properly at that time? And suddenly the floodgate of memories can come forward, and we have to then hold ourselves. We have to get the support we need, whether that might be therapy, or it might be more isolation. It might mean like taking more time for yourself and less engaged with other people so you could begin to see and feel yourself more clearly. But either way, I want to say that our conversation, your willingness to speak out about it, my willingness, any of ours willingness, that is a part of this work and this solution, because there's far too many times where people come forward about abuse and then they're the ones that get blamed for speaking out. And what you said in terms of the denial and then anger and just all the stages that people go through, it doesn't make it okay. Even though they're named as stages of denial, it doesn't make it okay as a survivor of abuse when you come out and you don't get the support that you need from your community or from your family. It makes it that much harder for us to voice up. Is there any other stories that you can share with us that helps us context some of the experiences that you've been able to extract that maybe you framed as good and then suddenly realize, no, that wasn't so good?
Thank you. There probably are, but none is coming immediately to mind.
Well,
I mean,
anything,
there was,
yeah, go ahead.
well, it's like years of spending really, really a lot of time with Metapiare. And so like, because we'd do trips to the city together, regularly. Sometimes I'd stay at the farm, like it was, we were together very frequently. And so like, when you spend so much time with someone, it's hard to come up with the individual stories because it's all kind of blended together.
Well, if as I'm talking, you think of something, please make sure you let me know before we wrap up today.
Okay.
Um, what I wanted to say was that as we started engaging with our emails and then wanted you to be on this podcast, just in the exchanging of the emails, as I was getting flooded with memories of like, what did actually take time during that school? What was the real context of why it got shut down? Um, of course, I remembered all of the story that I knew and held, which was very much a painted picture that my father had given me. I was very much under his lens of when Mark describes people coming to the board and being influenced. I wasn't on the board, but I was influenced. I mean, I was under my father's vision for what the school was, but I was the paid employee busting my behind to hire and make sure we had the certifications and these types of things. What I want to say is when all of these memories started flooding me, of course, I call anyone in my life that might remember. Do you remember why the school got shut down? Do you remember why we moved to St. Paul so fast? And I call Cutting, I call my stepmom and my dad's wife at the time. And I say, do you have any recollection? Now, just to give you context, at that time, she's supporting her household, which is my dad and her, and the farmhouse. And she's driving 45 minutes each way to go to her school, where she was a preschool teacher of a Montessori school, not having anything to do with our Summit school. So she's just trying to hold down her life and was very much, we were all focused on the school and she was very much just paying the bills and was the breadwinner because my dad was not working. He had his own drinking habit and he did whatever he wanted basically. And so I called her. I was like, do you have any recollection? And her only thing that she got to say out loud that she was like, all I remember him saying was, Mark turned on me. And I want to say this out loud on this podcast because this is classic narcissistic behavior, classic sociopathic behavior. And getting the lens into Mark's experience being mentored by Minneapolis, and for that to be his language, even if they weren't communicating much, because they weren't, for that to be kind of the remnants of her kind of basic memory. I'm sure she'll probably have more memories that flood over the next, several months, because that's how our memory works. But to me, it's just so classic Minneapolis. Like, oh, really? That's the story? The story is Mark Bailey gets pulled into the police, and this 17-year-old, 18-year-old adult mentee of Minneapolis is the one to blame for the scenario.
Yeah, I did turn on him. I told the truth, and he expected me to keep lying.
There it is, ladies and gentlemen. There it is. Mark said what happened, saying it out loud, right? And in a public forum. And you spoke about this, was that you learned really well how to keep secrets. And this is so profound because I think this reverberates very loudly in the atmosphere of 3HO, Kundalini Yoga atmosphere. Keeping secrets about things that we don't even have to keep a secret. There's nothing really to keep a secret from, but it's a form of control. It's a form of controlling a narrative, and it's maintaining even a false narrative that you might have been embedded as a philosophy of living, that we have to do this, but these people can't know about this, or these people can't. And it's so deeply subtle, but it forms a sense of identity of a false power, of a false like one up, that I'm doing this and this person doesn't know. And it's, I think it's really linked to the manipulation of the will.
I mean, that the first thing that came to mind just then was, I was thinking about cotting, and, we barely spent any time together. We knew each other, and there were a couple times when we'd maybe all sit and eat or something like that. but I do remember Mera Piare having things that he was hiding from Karing, mostly like if we were gonna sit and drink a bunch of beer, he didn't want Karing to find out, so we would have to like pretend like we weren't drunk or, ridiculous stuff like that.
Well, I mean, that was one of the things you said to me, is that you and my husband at the time, that you would go off and do different drugs, and that his thing was make sure I don't know. So It was like, for me, that, the symbolism of that marriage was very much that same secrecy passing on, right? Whether it was infidelity or whether it was like secret drug use or secret drinking or anything, but just the whole energy of the secrecy has been something I've wrestled with my whole life. And I remember being like 18 and kind of like making a steadfast, like, I stand for transparency and I stand for truth, and not realizing that my whole nervous system and all of my muscle tissue and all of my psychological training has been around deceit.
Right.
Has been high level manipulative, subtle body control. So as much as I want to stand for telling the truth, I don't know how. I'm a living lie, I'm a living, and to wake up to that, to realize, whoa, I'm just a product of my environment. It's kind of what you were saying. It's like, whoa, I just manipulated this person. I should feel good, but I don't, because that's a form of manipulation. How come I do that? I don't want to do that. Where did I learn that? Oh, geez. And then you start to look at yourself differently. You start recontexting things like healthy relationship that you thought you've always contexted as healthy. And you realize, whoa, that's just infused with enmeshment and other predatory, manipulative practices or ways of being and thinking. I think that your writing speaks to that very well, Mark. So I really encourage listeners to read some of his writing, especially just as a trauma survivor, as a sexual abuse survivor, but also just all levels of trauma, whether it's poverty and abandonment, and just all levels in which that we go through our life and don't necessarily see ourselves through the lens of a proper mental health diagnosis, and the help that sometimes the most disastrous things in our life can bring. And that's not to say that we deserved or called for any of these experiences, but it is to say that when we found ourselves in them, our learning process brought us to a sense of our own mental health awareness that let ourselves look properly, house this properly, name abuse for what it is, so that we can look at it properly instead of through the utopian lens that often is linked in magical thinking, and often using spiritual pedagogy to legitimize it. So a part of what really bothered me so much about hearing all this story is realizing that my father wasn't just a manipulative father, but his teachings, the way he carried on his own teachings in a very systematic, manipulative way that's so rooted to 3HO culture that he never processed within himself, and the impact that made on you and your life. And maybe countless other lives that we haven't even heard from yet,
Yeah.
Anything more you want to share here?
I think I'm good.
I want to really also speak to the sensitive period of time from 15 to 17. And you heard Mark talk about the overlap from where he was, being sexually abused from another man in the community where he was living until 16, and then from 15 to 17 ended up in Summit School for the Arts, and how this happens, that as we come from abuse of our own childhood, that we end up in spaces where we become more susceptible to other forms of abuse, not just physical, but subtle and psychological, and how there's a level of normalcy in lack of boundaries, and a level of normalcy and in the relationships that are formed that seem so good at the time that only later might we be able to house and see more clearly. And so a part of what this podcast stands for is being able to air things into the light. When we bring our stories out of the dark and into the light, they're not as scary. It doesn't necessarily make it any easier to process, but it's not as scary because we can see it. And I want to just appreciate Mark's writings because it really elevated this conversation for me out of the context of just the personal of my relationship and my healing of my father and my family, to the impact that any teacher or student of Why Be the Predator continues to have on their circle of influence. As teachers, as coaches, as shamans, as numerologists, as astrologers, as all of the personas of spiritual wisdom that carry on. And I know you've heard me speak of this before, but we're not going to end predator behavior. We have to get better at identifying it and feeling it as it's playing out. And like being an anti-racist, naming it in real time because we're doing our personal work enough to be able to be like, hey, that was really manipulative. Like, what was that? So for, again, Medi Piatti to say out loud, Mark turned on me. This is a young man that gets taken in to the police and he tells the truth. And a form of gaslighting is to then tell the people in your own life a context that doesn't give the full context of what just took place and your responsibility of the falling of that school, or my responsibility as a paid employee of that school. And I know I left that experience with a painted picture from Medi Piatti around why that school got shut down. And it didn't include my accountability for having lack of boundaries and doing illegal activity with minors, specifically, it's like, I didn't run a pot ring, but I was, smoking pot and sharing it with Mark so that he could go ahead and distribute it through the town. But, these things aren't okay. And yet living in the utopian world that Medi Piatti had created at that time, there were so many things going on that weren't okay. Because he lived in a culture of secrecy. And we're hearing now that that was a part of the tenets of the main behavior that was being played out, is to keep it a secret. And so as we break the silence and the secrecy that 3HO, the legacy, the 50-year legacy of the secrecy and what it means to see corrupt behavior and not talk about it out loud, to live another 20, 30 years of your life and not talk about things that you've seen. Your body remembers that. And so as your consciousness starts to remember it through these stories, be gentle and compassionate with yourself and also be real. Get the support that you need. Speak it out loud and be willing to get honest, because this is how we crack our identities and see ourselves properly and heal. Mark, your healing came from your willingness to examine your behavior. And your life in disruption made you look at yourself differently. You had to take the pause when a final disaster accident happened, and it made you just be like, what the heck is going on?
Yeah. I mean, it was like I fell through a broken outdoor fire escape and fell 3 stories, landed on my back. And so that kind of like rearranged my body and made it impossible for me to keep living my life the way that I had been. And so that accident put me in a position where I didn't really have a choice but to move forward. And there was no way to move forward unless I dealt with my shit. And there was no way to deal with my shit except as it came up. And then, and then like for me, it was a combination of the, working AA 12 steps and getting connected with real mental health and a good therapist and all that stuff. but it was like not a quick process. It wasn't done in a year, it was like several years, and then the process is ongoing, even now I'm still figuring out new stuff.
Yeah, you spoke about a decade of real intentional healing, of getting yourself on track, and I want to commend you because it's still an ongoing process. Our engagement, I know, has supported new levels of access of our own healing, and that's felt really good. It's disruptive, and yet it also is good because scar tissue can be like that, right? Something can have healed over, but it didn't really heal. It just kind of healed surfacely. And then there's stuff underneath. And when we get a chance to open up the conversation and turn the light on in the dark in some of these spaces, it supports collective and personal healing.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for giving us your lens into your experience with who was your mentor, Minneapolis, who happened to be my father. And it's helped me see my experience. I had metabolized so much of that, and then to also then see how he carried on in other mentee relationships. I think I was one of those early mentees, so I feel so much of your writing, and I thank you for the courage that it takes to share publicly.
Yeah. Thanks for creating space.
Anything more you want to share in regards to Minneapolis, in regards to what it means to subtle psychological manipulation, and anything else before we wrap up here?
Nothing comes to mind.
Do you want to introduce your song?
Oh,
why you chose this song?
Can't even remember which one I chose.
Okay, well, let's tell you what the song is. It's La Ciso, Don't Walk Away.
Oh, right.
How do you say that? La Ciso? La Siwo? La Siwo.
I've never heard it said out loud, so I don't even know.
Well, the music is La Siwo, Don't Walk Away. Do you want to share why you chose this one?
Well, these days I just listen to random things on YouTube, and I ran across this one a few weeks ago, and I love the combination of the melody and the beat, and I just think it's really nice.
All right, well, let's go ahead and hear a little bit of this song.
Here I go again. I've lost my head in the clouds. Lonely covers my mouth, and I'm waiting. You like to play pretend and let your words fall out, but I'm wiser now, and you're changing. And I will play your games, can't stop myself from caving. You got me wondering if I'm the one that's breaking.
And you can listen to the full playlist of the Uncomfortable Conversations playlist, because we can't play the whole song for copyright reasons, but there's an entire playlist that you can listen to for every episode. Thank you so much, Mark, for coming here and sharing your lens of experience. Today, we talked about a former 3HO member who continued to carry on his own persona as a spiritual seek wisdom, and, influenced other people even beyond the context of 3HO and other communities that he continued to carry on in his life. And I want to just speak out loud to listeners that this is continuing to happen present day. This isn't going away. And as we see the machine of Kundalini Yoga, 3HO carrying on, or whether it's any other community or appropriated practices that are showing up in spiritual environments in which people claim themselves to be, special wise people and guiding us to know ourselves more wholly and completely. And yet a lot of that special wisdom is wrapped up within very deep roots of predatory, manipulative, sociopathic, and narcissistic behavior. And the more we hear it and see it and name it, the more we can identify it within ourselves. and in the places that we find ourselves. Because as Teddy Pendergrass says, you can't hide from yourself, because everywhere you go, there you are. And so when we don't process and heal our past, and we aren't willing to relook at it, we pass it on. And what Resmaa Menakem describes in his book, My Grandmother's Hands, we blow our pain through other people. And I want to just say, in specifically and in memory of my father, Mary Piare, Lee-Vern Lars Moeller, this man used whatever persona best served his benefit to get what it is he wanted. And that behavior of using people around you to get what you want is very historically rooted in unprocessed pain of his own. And when he was dying, he said the same thing. So many people hurt me. It wasn't about how many people he hurt. It wasn't about looking at himself clearly. And we all have that choice. We can look at whatever lens we want. But when we've hurt other people and we come from predatory backgrounds and then unconsciously blow that pain in other people, we leave people in the aftermath. And the students of Summit School for the Arts represent that. And Mark is just one of them, but he has had the courage enough to be processing his pain and to do the best he can to heal himself in his own past, to show up as best as he can in the present. And that's all we can do, is the best that we can, to speak truth to our lives instead of the lenses and the painted pictures that we were given to rationalize behavior that frankly just were never and won't ever be okay. So that is today's episode of the Uncomfortable Conversations podcast, the untold stories of the 3HO Kundalini Yoga community. If you would like to make a donation and support this work, please go to gurunishan.com and or /uncomfortable conversations, and it'll bring you right to the page where you can donate. If you'd like to share your story, please email me at gn@gurunishan.com and send me an email, and let's spark up our own conversation and share your story on the podcast. Thank you again, listeners. Please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform. And I thank you so much for your listening and for your compassionate heart to do this inner work of dismantling, dismembering, and remembering clearly.